of the 2019-2020 Greater Chicago Chapter ASSP group. My name is Eric Dangoy, and I am your outgoing president. As you should know, our new chapter year begins in July of 2020 with some new faces. But if you are looking to help out in any capacity, we're always, can't stress enough, looking for people that are enthusiastic about safety and about growing the profession and our humble organization. So please feel free to contact us at our website. Me personally also, I reached out to you with the time earlier today. Be aware and along the lines of finding out what you want and what you need as a chapter member, be on the lookout for an annual member assessment survey in your email inbox. If you don't receive one by the end of today or end of this week, feel free to contact me directly. You might need to whitelist us, but as in past years, we will be raffling off 3 $50 gift cards to people that complete within the week the member assessment survey. It's 10 minutes and less, and it's very useful information to help us decide to figure out what you need as a member. All right, so we have some, before we get started, of course, we have some housekeeping items for you. If you're just entering, please be sure to find your mute button on the MS Teams. It is very distracting that you might not hear on your end, but we might receive a lot of feedback for the speaker. And there will also be a survey at the end specific to this presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to add it to the chat bar, and we will bring it to Dennis's attention to address at the conclusion of this meeting, or in a future email that can address everybody's questions. So I would like to present Dennis Turpin. He is the owner-operator of the International Safety and Health Specialists. He is also a master level instructor for the Center for Domestic Preparedness through FEMA and DHS and the Emergency Management Institute. He is a retired senior industrial hygienist and emergency manager at the UIC and has over 50 years of experience in occupational safety and health, lab safety, and emergency management and response fields. Some of his most noteworthy accomplishments, besides holding 18+ certifications and speaking at over 50, 60 professional major conferences, he has responded to incidents of national impact such as 9/11, the 1990 F5 tornado in Plainfield, Illinois, and responded to many community and industrial-based incidents. He was a safety officer for President Obama's visit to the UIC, the Chicago World Summit of Nobel Peace Laureates meeting in Chicago, the Chicago NATO Summit, and many more. I'd like you to please welcome Dr. Dennis Turpin.
Well, thank you, Eric, and welcome. And you'll see my email at the beginning and the last slide of the presentation. Any questions that we do not have time to answer, please send me an email and I will answer every single question that is generated, probably getting it back to you no later than Monday or Tuesday. So before we take off, I want to thank all the essential workers, all of our fire, police, EMS, healthcare, everybody that has taken care of us, and all of our food stores. They have been there through us. You made it a little bit easier for us to get through this. So we are facing probably the most unique challenge we have ever faced in occupational safety and health, especially for the Respiratory Protection Program Administrator. We are seeing new challenges pop up in day-to-day operations, changes in our workforce, cross-training of employees, PPE shortages, tons of misleading information, fit testing and training concerns. In fact, I updated 2 slides today because of a couple changes that CDC had made on cloth face coverings, and we'll kind of get into that here in a little bit. Multiple person operations. How do we social distance if we have multiple employee operations? And then we deal with non-compliance issues. So we have to look at all of these changes, and not only in the respiratory protection program, but every single one of the standards that interreacts with respiratory protection, especially personal protective equipment. We have to look not only at the temporary changes, but we have to look at specific jobs and job sites. If you're a program administrator and you're trying to make decisions and you've never seen the job site, especially in construction, you are really putting yourself, okay, in a situation where it's going to be really hard for you to make decisions. We have to look at all of the new technologies that are out there for filtering face piece respirators. We'll talk a little bit about the UV, and we'll talk about the hydrogen peroxide, but all of these are temporary. But our main focus in our cleaning is, don't forget, we have our Appendix B2, which is a mandatory part of the component. So if we look at COVID and we look at our day-to-day operations that we had in October, all of a sudden we're saying we still have silica, we still have asbestos, we still have bloodborne pathogens, and now we have to interreact because we have a new hazard, and that new hazard is COVID. And the reason we know it, because OSHA has reversed this decision, and now based on certain qualifications and requirements, we have to now relist it on our OSHA 300 logs. But so many things are happening. Your primary job is to prevent exposure. So if we look at the respiratory protection and program administrator, okay, that is your main job. So all of the elements of the respiratory protection standard are still there. Some of them are a little changed. Some of them, there's tremendous changes in them. And it's our job. So at this point, if you updated your respiratory protection program January 1st of 2020, I can guarantee you, you should have at least 3 revisions since that date, because 3 or 4 major changes or temporary guidance has happened that requires us to modify our programs. So as the respiratory protection administrator, by standard, that person has to be qualified by the appropriate training and experience, which is based on the complexity of the program that he or she is going to administer. The example right now in the hospital setting, we have infectious disease specialists who are becoming the respiratory protection administrator. But how many more employees in that hospital setting actually utilize respiratory protection? And over the last 5 or 6 weeks, we are going to find that individuals that we never thought would have to wear respiratory protection now have to wear it because of COVID. So if we look at the standard, and basically the standard tells us that if we see a word that says shall, that's a mandatory part of the standard. If it's just advisory, the word should is in the standard. But now we're also dealing with temporary enforcement guidance during COVID-19. So we've seen a lot of talk about the hierarchy of controls and how can we utilize that to try to make our jobs a lot easier. Well, it helps us navigate the hazards. And we look at things like ventilation and protective clothing and engineering controls such as water ventilation. But we still have that one problem. We have a lot of jobs that are multiple employee jobs that now are going to require PPE and respiratory protection. Silica is still there. And if you just cut one paver in half, and I supplied the link to the white paper, just by cutting one brick of silica, the amount of silica that's released in the air is 10,714 days worth of exposure. And that is not going to be limited to just that one job application. So we have to look at reducing the period exposure, adding appropriate work practices, using monitor or warning devices, good housekeeping, and really getting a good hold on our respiratory protection standard. And then we got to deal with alternate respiratory protection for healthcare. All of a sudden, that supply of N95s dried up. And then they released the national stockpile, but it wasn't the same filtering face piece respirator that we were used to or we were using at our healthcare facilities. Did that require additional fit testing? Yes, and we're going to get into it. So the employer still must provide respirators, training, medical evaluations at no cost to the employee. That hasn't changed. The only thing that's changed now is now we have COVID, which basically is a hazard that's all over our facilities. And now we have to incorporate that extra hazard. So we look at one of our first problems, that's our newest problem, is our N95 respirators, our filtering face piece respirators. They're becoming scarce. And a lot of construction sites or a lot of jobs that require the use of an N95 or higher, because their employees were subjected to heat, utilize respiratory protection with exhalation valves. But we're now finding out that a lot of our facilities are outlawing that type of respirator, because that respirator, through testing, has proven that if somebody has tested positive or somebody's asymptomatic and they exhale through that N95 respirator with the exhalation valve, those COVID viruses get out into the open. So what does that say about our half-face respirators? Well, you can see what CDC and NIOSH say, okay, about respirators with exhalation valves that can't be used in a sterile situation. So that's one of our newest challenges we're dealing with now. N95 respirators with exhalation valves that may not be suitable for some applications. And then we're finding that because of COVID, we can no longer share PPE that we used to share, especially if we're dealing with arc flash. And that's the guidance document you see up on the right. It says we should not share that PPE anymore. Again, a new challenge for us. So we have to maintain our programs. We have to evaluate for hazards. We have to assess that hazard to the worker. We have to select the appropriate respirator. And we have to make sure medical exams are conducted prior. And that licensed healthcare professional, they need to know why your employee is going to be wearing a respirator, what the hazard is, excluding environmental hazards like humidity, high temperature, cold temperature. So we have to understand the differences. So if we look at our cloth face coverings and we look at our loose fitting masks, they are not considered PPE on the OSHA. There's 3 or 4 spots and a letter of interpretation that pretty much says loose fitting masks are subject to the PPE standard, but are not considered PPE that we would deal with respiratory protection. Sounds kind of confusing, so we're going to spend some more time on that. We have to look at respiratory illness clusters to get an understanding. We have 9/11 where a lot of the first responders got sick. Or we deal with our meatpacking industries, and we're looking at the fact that the high percentage of our meatpacking employees. And then we look at healthcare. If they're still getting exposed and testing positive, what are we doing wrong? Well, maybe in increased ventilation, or maybe putting partitions. All of that is coming to play as part of our respiratory protection. So if we look at risk-based exposure, we try to minimize the number of employees exposed. That's pretty hard to do. We minimize the amount of infectious aerosols. Well, that's something we could work on. And we try to protect all the employees that could be exposed, and we could do that. So we look at our RAIN concept. We recognize the hazard, we avoid exposure, we isolate, and we notify. But we have to review documentation. We have to observe the employee activities, then survey conditions, and make our best judgment. Now, if you're from a state agency or you're from a state school and you're not fed or private sector, the Center of Domestic Preparedness offers a 3-day course where you will become a respiratory program administrator. Plus, you will have the opportunity to go into a real hot environment wearing level C. That's the address. And the 2 next classes that are available are September and October. So if you qualified, usually state, local first responders, all of healthcare, look at the CDP website. That's only one of 50 courses that are 100% grant funded. Yes, I said 100% grant funded. So if we look at risk-based selection, we've got this dose-response relationship. Now, the little arrow pointing to that little dot is actually the COVID. So, and it's 0.15 to 0.2, and yes, that's less than 0.3 microns. We'll talk more about that here in a second. We have to look at pathways into the body. We already have documented exposure of eye contact causing positive. So we have to look at particle size concentration, donning and doffing procedures, industrial hygiene results, and then we got to look at all of those unknown factors. So what I try to do in my training programs, I try to relate with something everybody is familiar with, and that's like a grain of sand, a human hair, kind of give them an idea. Now, for those of you who have read some of my white papers on LinkedIn, and I have about a dozen on respiratory protection. If you haven't, please join my group. We talk about things that pop up. So I'm very big into the chain of infection. So if we're in an area where we're looking to reopen a restaurant or reopen classrooms, you gotta look at the ASHRAE study, and you gotta look at the CD study on the restaurant in China that you see on the lower screen, where individuals got exposed at different tables because somebody, patient of diner C1, actually was asymptomatic and positive, and the air conditioning actually blew the particulates over to the possible tables. So the currents actually spread the virus. So if you're into ventilation or looking at, well, do I have to worry about something about tables and close to ventilation? You really got to look at the ASHRAE studies, and you got to really look at the CDC. So what we have found out that the cloth face coverings don't fit into anything. So what Cornell University did, they came up with they added a new tip of our heart rate controls, and they call it community protective equipment. And I actually really like that. And I sent you the link over there for the read their paper on it. So face masks, we're talking about cloth face masks, only filter out about 2% of the larger particles. That's half the protection of a surgical mask, 50 times less than the N95s. Plus, they provide very limited protection to small particles. That's our cloth face mask. But cloth face masks will lose any value unless it's combined with frequent hand washing and social distancing. So we really have to look at that as we put all of our stuff together. So there's some links for you so you can kind of read up and some of the new science that's out there about these, and we'll talk more about this in a second. But again, our N95, our filtering face piece respirators, in some cases, is the way to go. And you have to understand the construction of that N95, how it works, the electrostatic treatment, and the multi-fibers to understand how it's capable of trapping 95% or around of the COVID. virus particles, especially those small ones, even the ones that are less than 0.3. So I just kind of added this slide today because the CDC did a couple changes on cloth face coverings. So again, cloth are not surgical masks, nor are they N95 respirators. They're community protective equipment. In your training programs, if you are going to allow your employees, or it's mandatory for your employees, either by your company policy or by state regulations, to wear this has to be built into your training program, and it doesn't really fall under respiratory protection. So it's either going to have to fit under PPE, or because it's really not PPE, so it's going to have to fit in, probably looking at the general duty clause. But all of these parts have to be in your training program. And you really have to evaluate the new cloth face covers that are coming out with exhalation valves. They may be defeating your purpose, and we'll talk more about that here in a second. So, risk-based selection, doing a job safety analysis. So what we have here is a building engineer who changes out filters in HVAC systems. Now, it could be a regular filter, it could be a HEPA filter, but the point is, we would have never considered that to be a really hazardous job. But if we look at the requirements now, and especially if you get into the ASHRAE documentation in their white paper, you'll see that job will now require at least an N95. And I'm a really big component of P100s. And so basically, you're going to put your engineers into level C with non-vented goggles and have protocols and policies for changing out filters and ductwork, something we never did before for most of us. So San Diego State University, this is their chart for their facilities. So they have incorporated their cloth face coverings, their P100 respirator, and their eye protection gloves. And this is kind of their what they're playing with now. This is where we're all going to have to go. So we look at risk-based health and safety. These are hazards that electricians face. But now we add COVID to it. So again, we got this other second hazard. Now, Dr. Lisa Purcell, she was at UIC and at the University of Minnesota. She has a white paper out on how the aerosol, if it's dispersed in air, where the larger and smaller particles can go, and how you can get a cross-contamination of infection of patient C, looking at risk assessment versus risk management. You really need to look at that paper. If you just Google the University of Minnesota and it's aerosol and her name, you'll pull it right up. And it's part of our new risk assessment. Just like we have to, with all of the other respiratory hazards that are out there, and we look at on Lincoln's chin, there's a little circle which contain about 20,000 asbestos fibers, and that little green dot is the 8-hour permissible exposure level to crystalline silica. You have to make sure your employees realize how small these particles are and how important it would be for us. So we have to look at, when we choose respirators, the size of the particle, the nature of the hazard, the chemical and physical properties, the concentration of the contaminant. And then we have to look at how we're going to control these in the environment. Now, all of the studies that have been done as far as work activities and individuals who wear filtering face piece respirators during their pregnancy, most of those are based on a 1-hour exposure. And now those same people are wearing respirators for 8 to 12 hours. So we have to build into our selection factors the period the respirator is worn, the stress, biological work rate, the work activities, fit testing, and the physical characteristics to be able to choose the correct type of respiratory protection. We have loose fitting, okay, tight fitting. I'm not going to spend a lot of this because this is part of our respiratory protection, and I'll show you how this kind of builds in a little bit. But if we're doing a selection of respirators, we start out at looking at air purifying, air supplying, and we have to build in are protection factors. Now, I just read a paper yesterday where somebody made a comment. I didn't have time to research it, and said that a filtering face piece respirator and a half face elastomeric respirator, that the elastomeric respirator was more protective. Well, I'm going to pose that question to you. How is it more protective? It has the same protection factor. Then we look at the maximum use concentration, and basically that's going to tell us that no matter what type of respirator we're wearing, especially air purifying, there's going to be a limit where that respirator can get overloaded, the cartridges. And at that point, our employees are no longer protective. We could take a hazard approach, looking at ideal H and non-ideal H, and going to try to choose the correct level of respiratory protection. This is a great graph to use. And you can add your own chemicals to this, add your own hazard, and you're going to come out with your own little guide to choosing. But everybody, especially construction and contractors, remember your NR and P series, not resistance to oil, somewhat resistance, and strongly resistance. So if that individual there who's got a filtering face piece respirator, now if that saw ran on a fuel oil mixture, would an NR and R series work? Absolutely not. Because of that oil mist, that individual needs to be in a P series respirator. If you haven't seen the job site, you're never going to be able to make those judgments. You got to see the equipment. How about this? We have the individual working on the left-hand side, and then we have individuals going left to right who may be laborers or doing other jobs. But because they are downwind of the crystalline silica cloud, they probably would have to be in a P100 respirator. If you don't see the job site, you don't see this hazard. This is risk-based assessment. So we look at the physical and psychological impacts, heat stress. Somebody who's wearing a respirator versus somebody who is not, in a high humidity atmosphere, will not be able to wear it as long. And then if we look at the fact that some of our filtering face piece respirators can build up carbon dioxide levels over a longer period of time, which basically slows their ability to work, we have to factor that in, and there's the link for you. We talked about the use during pregnancy. That's your link down there. Again, the study was only done for an hour at a time. So now we have our March 14th temporary enforcements guidance. Now we've got to build this in. The higher the dose of a virus given to a healthy volunteer, the worse their symptoms. All about the chain of infection. As these changes take place, you need to incorporate them into your respiratory protection program. It becomes part of your adjustment. Remember, record keeping says you do it once a year, and unless something significant happens. Well, there's been a lot of significant things happening right now. A surgical mask is not a respirator. If you really want to get me going, call an N95 a mask. It's not. A surgical mask is not a respirator, and an N95 is a respirator. It's a negative pressure respirator. We need to incorporate that into our training. People are getting confused. We have to look at our employees and classify them as COVID exposure risk, low, medium. All of this is all documented in OSHA and NIOSH and CDC. And try to figure in, how do we protect our employees? If there's any first responders down there, I got a great webinar that was produced by an insurance company, which is available on YouTube for you. Just put it down, email it to me, or go to that link. But the 2-hour webinar, I'll get you the link. All about protecting all first responders, fire, PD, EMS as you respond. And those are going to be our high exposures. And then we have very high, anybody that does any type of aerosolization procedures in healthcare. We look at the ever-changing use of respiratory protection and PPE. So the reuse and extended use of N95s has changed a lot in the last 3 months. You need to constantly go. In fact, you can go on CDC's website now and you could sign up and they'll send you every time they make a change. So you don't have to hunt them down that way. Oh, you know, hey, clot face respirators, I need to add a slide for today. If that wasn't enough, and now we got to deal with counterfeit respirators. So we're looking at, and I'm not talking about KN95s right now. I'm talking about 3M 8210s. So you need to go on 3M's website, and the link is provided on the bottom to kind of stay current to some of the concerns they're having dealing with counterfeit respiratory protection. And we'll spend a little bit of time on the KN95s here in a second. So those are some ideas how you can spot the phonies, the fakes from the reals. But again, you have a concern, please go to 3M's website. Fit factors. You have to remember that fit factor we utilize when we fit test, a fit factor of 100 means the air inside the respirator. I hope you caught that because I put the word mask there on purpose. I wanted to see if anybody would say, hey, he just said an N95 is a mask. Yeah, that's why I put that there. We need to change that in our training program. So a fit factor of 100 means that the air inside the respirator is 100 times cleaner than the air outside. For your first responders out there and you respond to terrorist events, seaborne, chemical, biological, radioactive, and nuclear, based on your manufacturer's OSHA's fit factor is 500 for general industry. For emergency response, you could be up to 2,500 or 2,800 based on your manufacturer's guidelines. And remember, anything we do as far as cleaning, fit testing, certification of respirators, swapping out respirators, it's based on the OSHA guidelines or the manufacturer's guidelines, which either is the more stringent. I'll get more into that here in a second. For a medical evaluation, they need to know why we're wearing that respirator. They're going to be in the ductwork. It's going to be in a confined area. It's going to be hot and humid. That's all part of the medical evaluation. In China, they found out initially why so many clinicians were having heart attacks and strokes because of the carbon dioxide that was building up in their respirators, in their filtering face piece respirators. And they were wearing these respirators for 8 to 10 hours at a time, building up their carbon dioxide levels in their bloodstream. Again, go to that link. It's interesting reading. So can anybody fit test? I get 3 or 4 emails. How do I fit test? Well, there's a right way and there's a wrong way. If you want to know the right way, well, then go to ANSI Z8810. So on Z8810, in fact, or go to the ASSP General Conference last year. My super session was on Z8810, basically setting up fit testing protocols. But we have 26103, we have EPA directive, then we have the ANSI Z8810. They'll tell you what exactly we need to do. So general fit operators shall be properly trained and demonstrate proficiency. That means you need to know everything about everything for respirators. You get a question, well, how does my filters work? What is a positive and negative seal check? Okay. Individuals with poorly fitting respirators were often detected only through fit testing. Fit testing is the key, and you only get one chance to do it right. And when we fit test a specific respirator, manufacturer, model, and size to a specific face. You only get one choice. So then we have qualitative and quantitative fit test. So if you have a protection factor of 10, you could do qualitative or you could do quantitative. But if you have a fit factor, a protection factor greater than 10, by regulation, you have to do quantitative fit tests on those full face air purifying respirators. And how many times do you just Google fit testing on the internet and you see full face respirators being fit tested with saccharin, sitting down? We're going to talk all about that stuff because you only get one chance to do it right. And if you're utilizing different types of media, banana oil, saccharin, Bitrex, irritant smoke, and most of us don't use irritant smoke because it's so toxic. But if you did, you need to have a P100. So you have to pick the right filter when you're doing fit testing, especially on your elastomeric respirators. So we fit test a manufacturer, make, model, size to a specific phase. So let's talk a little bit about qualitative and quantitative fit testing. First of all, fit testing, doesn't matter what type of fit testing you do, shall be performed while the test subject is wearing any applicable safety equipment that must be worn during actual respirator use and could interfere with the respirator fit. So which means that anything you see here for our pharmacy techs, that protective clothing comes in contact with the respirator, our face shield, our welding helmet, our bunker gear, you have to have all that stuff on during fit testing. And it doesn't matter if you're doing quantitative or qualitative. If you're doing just a hood with your Bitrex or saccharin, or you're looking to do technology, you have to have your equipment on, especially if it interferes with the respirator or touches the respirator, and you must be standing up. At the start, if you didn't do that, well, you're not doing a proper fit test, which means your employees probably have a higher possibility of potential of exposure. For fit testing for quantitative, we have particle counting or controlled negative pressure. Two different types of technology. The quantitative fit test is destructive to the N95s. That's why OSHA gave up some variants saying basically that you could utilize our qualitative using your saccharin or Bitrex. So we look at the enforcement guidelines and we have to look at initial versus annual fit tests. And we're going to talk more about that because there's some confusion about it, and there's a link for you. Annual fit testing basically has been put on hold. So if you've been fit tested, you don't have to fit test again. But initial fit testing is still a requirement. So if somebody hasn't worn a respirator again, or you're changing the manufacturer, the size, small, regular, whatever it might be, the shape of the respirator, yes, you have to do initial fit testing. Go on the manufacturer's guidelines and they will tell you what is an acceptable equivalent. But generally speaking, if the respirator is the same size, it's equivalent. We call that preform. If it's flat folded, it's not equivalent, which means if you've been wearing an 8210 or you've been wearing an 1860, which is preformed or circular, and now you're going to be wearing a Technol or an 1870 plus, which is a duckbill flat folded, you need to fit test because it's a non-equivalent respirator. But check your manufacturer's guidance. It's on, it's on all of their websites. Now, fit testing there in COVID. You see a bunch of things going on. First of all, the same hood is used for an employee that was used for the sensitivity test. And that hood needs to be clean with an EPA approved disinfectant between employees. Only one set of nebulizers and they need to be cleaned between employees. We disinfect the inside of the hoods and the outer surfaces of the nebulizer. But again, we see in the top screen that they don't have a hood, so they're using a plastic bag. You have to realize the inside area of a hood is predetermined to the volume of the solution being sprayed in there at our different frequencies or time intervals. So you just can't put anything over your head and say you're going to do fit testing. And it's nearly impossible to practice social distancing when you're fit testing. So the fit tester needs to be in PPE. Now, if we look at our technology and we worry about subject matters, we find that we have to disinfect the outside of the fit testers. The adapters have to be disinfected between individuals. And I personally have seen moisture build up in the dual and triple tubings. So we need to have extra supplies. So a lot of us are playing around with quantitative and qualitative fit testing modified for social distancing. This is just a draft, and not everything is here that we want. And this is where we are right now. You talk about modified fit testing because of COVID, and this is not where we need to be with this, because there's nothing in here about the double and the dual and the triple tubing, okay, or than any negative pressure in our fit testers. But the manufacturers have all of that stuff on their websites. OSHA has adopted different fit test protocols. It's up to you to see what you want to use. It's an alternative. It's not mandatory. And if you're from a state, an OSHA state, then you have to see if your state approved it. If your state didn't approve it, then you can't use it. Particle counting. If we're going to be doing particle counting, a Porticon, Accutech 9000, nobody should be wearing makeup in the workplace right now and perfume, but you can see how makeup can interfere with the particulates on the inside of that filtering facepiece respirator. Facial hair. And we wonder why so many people are getting exposed out in the workplace, because how many people do you see wearing respirators? KN95s. Now, KN95s, again, if you go on NIOSH's website, it will list all of the legal respirators from other countries. But I can tell you from experience that even a really good KN95 with ear loops still has a 20 to 25% fit testing failure. The ear loops do not provide a tug, a nice snug fit on your face. Facial hair still comes to play, and if they were dentures, they got to have their dentures there during fit testing. Some new equipment that's just popped up on the market over here. This is from Accutech, and this is an automatic sensor, a piece of equipment that puts the grommets, so you never have to worry about anybody taking that little spike and putting them in your hand. We still have to do our positive and negative seal checks on our respirators. That's still mandatory. Now, Quantitech, that's the individuals who come out with the OHD, negative pressure fit tester. They've just come out with a QuantiCheck. Now, this is really I think, a very interesting tool to be utilized during training, because how do we teach that you really achieve a good positive and negative seal check? I know we train, we teach, but this, you actually hook it into your filtering into your elastomeric respirator, and electronically it monitors if you achieved a good seal check, both positive and negative. Then you take that memory and say, okay, this is how my respirator felt during this training. I want to make sure it feels the same way when I'm out in the field. So check it out, OHD. Product's only been out about a month and a half. Now, B2, our respirator cleaning, this is what is necessary for our elastomeric respirators. Yes, after every use, including fit testing. What you see on the left, alcohol wipes, not only is that appropriate, but it's damaging your respirator. So here, the center picture are Millenniums, full face APRs, air purifying respirators. On the right are Avon 50s. You actually field strip that respirator based on manufacturer's guidelines. You break it down, you soak it in a cleaning disinfecting solution that approved for COVID. And based on the guidance of your manufacturer, and then it's set to air dry. And then for any respirator with a drinking tube, you have to blow out the drinking tube with the compressed air, as you see, so no moisture is left inside the drinking tube. So that's what's necessary under B2 mandatory of the standard as far as cleaning of your elastomeric respirators, half face or full face. So cleaning takes about 15 or 20 minutes, soaking 8 to 10 minutes, breaking it up, then it has to dry, then you have to put it back together after every use, including fit testing. Now, under our emergency guidance documents, we are actually allowed to utilize for the time being our ultraviolet radiation. And the first thing on your straps, like the 1860 that are hanging there on the bottom, that's actually vaporous hydrogen peroxide. You're going to start to see the elastic covering on the straps break. I just got some pictures. I need to add it to one of my programs. But again, this is what's being used out there. Our ultraviolet, our vaporous hydrogen peroxide, and our moist heat. All of this is on our emergency guidance documents. Make sure you read up on them. And remember, if you're using UV, that light has to touch all of the respirator components, inside and outside. If the light doesn't touch it, it's not disinfected. Plus, it's based on strength of the light plus contact time. So here we see our Avon 50 on the top. Those are the parts that we have to take apart based on the manufacturer's guidance documents. On the bottom, we still have to check our supplied air SCBAs. All those parts that are air operated or battery operated that save our lives out in the field, those have to be checked at least on a monthly basis based on manufacturer's guidelines. All of the stuff on the respiratory protection standard, it's still in play, but now we got to deal with all of this other stuff. Now we have to do occupational risk-based assessment of our workers, and even our workers who never wore respirators before, because we know COVID is there, and we know it's in the ductwork, we know it's in the filters. So now we have dual hazards that we have to protect our employees from. As far as picking filters, canisters, and cartridges, the best way to approach this is on your manufacturer's websites. They have all of the information there, and only use the website from the cartridge that you are utilizing. And with COVID, you're probably going to find you're going to be using a lot of dual cartridges now. You have to develop a change-out schedule. That means you look at the contaminants, the concentration, the frequency of the use, temperature, humidity, the employee's work rate. And then you have to look at interfering chemicals, and you have to develop a change-out schedule. Again, this is on the manufacturer's guidelines. Let me give you an example. So I had a client last year. She was in one of my classes, and she says, "This is really tough for me to do. I really need some guidance here." So I work in the foundry. I'm the safety person, and I'm going, hey, this is good. Back in the 90s, I worked for Ford as a safety consultant, and I worked at the Cleveland engine plant. I got some experience here. And she says, I look at my change-out schedule, and based on temperature and humidity, which are the two greatest factors that will utilize, will basically utilize lessen the life expectancy of your cartridges. And she says, my change-out schedule is 8 to 10 minutes. I can't afford to do this, not even considering loss of productivity. What is that telling me? My change-out schedule of 8 to 10 minutes. What's that telling me? And I looked at her. It's telling you one thing: you need to be on supplied air. Your employees shouldn't be on that full phase air purifying respirator. Okay, they need to be on supplied air, and either work on a tether line or plant air, which basically meets the qualifications for level of breathing air plus the periodic checks. Then you're not going to have to worry about the change-out schedule. But that's what you need to do, and you have to do it more now because we have a new dual hazard in our workplace. So everything we talked about needs to be built into your training programs. Plus the two parts of the program that need to be done 100% correctly is fit testing. Now, I used to be able to teach that. In fact, I used to, when I used to set my fit testers up, I used to show them how to do 3 to 5 people at a time. Can't do it now because you can't share nebulizers. You have to clean out the inside of the hood and the outside. So you have all these other factors built in now. Plus, the fit tester is going to have to be in some level of PPE. So just the fit testing process itself with the 5-minute pre-wear is 15 plus minutes, unless you're doing a quantitative fit test, and then you're still going to be around 10 minutes. So you really have to factor this into your time frame. But doffing is the time where employees can get cross-contaminated. So when you evaluate your program, for some of us now, it may be on a weekly basis. We have to look at the type and the extent of the hazards in your workplace. Remember, if you evaluated your respiratory protection program and you didn't incorporate COVID, it's out of date. Types of respirators your employees use. And if you're changing because of short supply, at least try to get respirators that the manufacturer says are equivalents, so you don't have to go back and fit test again on initial fit test. You can make up their 3M and other places do have directions for making up your own batches of saccharin and Bitrex. And there was a question that popped up. What happens if people doing qualitative fit testing and they cheat and they tell you that they don't taste it when they do? That's been around for decades. That's why any critical employee that I'm fit testing, if I utilize Bitrex, because they're going to show a reaction to Bitrex. The number of employees who use respirators, and that's got to escalate now in the workplaces. The amount of experience your respirator wearing employees have using the respirators, because you may have to incorporate some training as far as what happens if you knock it off your face, or now you're utilized. You may even have to for two-person jobs. We've been doing that for hazmat for decades on hazmat calls. You may have to put individuals in level C and actually have a decon station so they can safely remove that PPE for dual or 2 or more employee jobs. We've been doing it for hazmat. You may be doing it for the types of jobs you do in construction or confined space now. As far as Appendix D, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because you can have a whole program on this. If you go up to your employee and say, we want you to voluntarily wear this respirator, so a real respirator, even a KN95. If it's a negative pressure respirator, you ask them to wear it, it's not voluntary. Okay. If you ask your employee to voluntarily wear a respirator, it's not voluntary use of a respirator. If they come to you and ask, you need to evaluate, and then you follow Appendix D. As far as cloth face coverings, those are community protective devices. They're really not OSHA PPE, and the documentation is there to prove it. At that point, you need to incorporate that into your PPE standard, because you may be dealing with a guideline that is mandated by your state.
About 5 more minutes, Dennis.
Yeah, I got it. So thanks. So record keeping, really easy here. Your medical evaluation is a medical record. You keep that based on your company policy. A fit testing record, you only need to keep your fit testing record until the next fit test. Fit testing records are not medical and not subject to record keeping. Your medical medical are. And how often should you do the questionnaire? I like to do them at least the questionnaire once a year because there's too many changes going on in the workplace. Now, you may be dealing with workers that never did the job before because you got a bunch of workers that are sick. So all of this stuff is in play. So one last thing, any questions that you think of between now and Friday, email them to me at my email address, and Monday or Tuesday. And when I say I will answer them, the last webinar I did, I had 18 pages of answers and it took me a week, but I got them to every single person. So Eric, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you. Sorry for interrupting. Didn't realize we were right there, but I should have trusted you. You know exactly what you're doing. Thank